June 5, 1944, 23:30 hours. The English Channel lies beneath a thin veil of moonlight, restless and cold. Along the southern coast of Britain, men in khaki overalls work in near silence. The sea wind bites at their faces as they haul strange shapes into the night sky. Vast clusters of silver-gray balloons, each carrying bundles of shimmering metallic strips. They rise slowly, drifting eastward toward France, their chords whispering against the wind. In radar stations along the French coast, German operators squint at green-lit screens. Blips begin to bloom across their scopes. Dozens at first, then hundreds. The echoes form patterns, fleets of ships, squadrons of bombers, an invasion force. Phones ring, officers rush in, orders are shouted. The German coastal batteries turn their guns toward a phantom army. But there are no fleets, no engines, no men, only silence, and the faint flutter of foil catching the moonlight, gliding with the wind toward occupied Europe. The engineers watching from the cliffs know what they've unleashed. A deception so delicate and vast, it could bend the enemy's vision. Beneath these drifting ghosts, real soldiers prepare to cross the channel. The illusion must hold, because tonight, illusion is survival. By the spring of 1944, war had become a contest of waves and echoes. Invisible lines of energy crisscross the skies of Europe. Pulses, reflections, and static that determined who would live and who would die. Radar, the unseen eye of the Reich, guarded the coasts of occupied France and the Low Countries. From Norway to Normandy, German antennas scanned the horizon, searching for the first glint of an invasion that everyone knew would come. Radar had begun as a miracle of German precision. The Freya early warning sets could detect aircraft almost 100 miles away. The Würzburg radars, smaller but deadly accurate, guided searchlights and flak batteries to their targets. Together, they formed a shimmering curtain of detection. British night bombers had learned the price of defying that curtain. The glow of tracer fire, the silent arcs of searchlights finding them, and the sudden flash of flak that turned night into day. The Allies understood. Before D-Day could begin, the German radar wall had to be blinded, or at least deceived. Across the Channel, British and American scientists, many of them engineers scarcely past their 20s, labored inside cramped rooms filled with oscilloscopes and cigarette smoke. They studied the German frequencies, measuring every pulse, every echo. Among them were American radar specialists from the Signal Corps, sent to join their British counterparts in the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, at Malvern. Their task was both scientific and desperate. Find a way to fool the enemy's radar without silencing their own. The solution, when it came, seemed absurdly simple. A physicist named Joan Curran, working for the British Air Ministry, discovered that thin strips of aluminum foil, each cut precisely to half the wavelength of German radar, could create phantom reflections. When dropped from aircraft, these strips produced an image identical to that of a real bomber formation. They called it window. The Americans, running parallel experiments, called it chaff. The first trials were uncanny. On radar screens, the scattered foil clouds looked like entire fleets of aircraft. The ghosts drifted, merged, split, impossible to distinguish from real targets. Curran's accidental invention became the seed of a new form of warfare, electronic illusion. But to use it required nerve. If Germany learned the secret, they could use it in return. For months, both sides hesitated. The deception waited, stored in secret hangars, until the day the Allies needed to hide an army. By early 1944, that day was near. The invasion of France would expose hundreds of ships and thousands of planes to German detection. The planners of Operation Overlord needed a veil large enough to cover an entire continent. So the engineers turned to window again. This time, not just dropped from aircraft, but carried aloft by balloons. floating mirrors of metal drifting across radar beams like ghosts of steel. The idea sounded fantastical, but war had long since blurred the line between science and imagination. The first prototypes were tested along the British coast, released into the gray morning air. Within minutes, radar stations miles away were filled with echoes, flickering constellations of false fleets. The illusion worked. Those who witnessed it understood what it meant. The ability to conjure armies from thin air, to save real men with unreal shapes. But the enemy still watched, vigilant, convinced that the next invasion would strike at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. And so deception became not just a tactic, it became a shield. As the Channel winds carried those early test balloons eastward, Allied commanders began to see a plan forming, a weapon not of fire, but of reflection. A war could now be won with ghosts. In the months leading to D-Day, southern England transformed into the largest deception laboratory the world had ever seen. Beneath camouflage nets and guarded compounds, US and British engineers built illusions by the ton, dummy tanks of inflated rubber, plywood aircraft, and fleets of fake landing craft. Yet, among all the inventions, none seemed as quietly powerful as the drifting shapes that rode the wind. Balloons trailing ribbons of metal, designed to confuse machines rather than men. The origin of the plan lay in a single insight. The Germans trusted their radar more than their eyes. Through the winter of 1943, Allied intelligence intercepted radio traffic from the Luftwaffe's Jagddivision II, which revealed just how dependent they had become on radar sweeps from Calais to Cherbourg. Every flicker on their screens triggered alarms, troop movements, and fuel-consuming patrols. It was a vulnerability hidden inside their strength. In London, the Deception Command, known as Ops B, under the British 21st Army Group, gathered physicists, map makers, and signal officers. The Americans brought their own experts from the Signal Corps laboratories and MIT's Radiation Laboratory, men accustomed to oscilloscopes and equations, now working to choreograph illusion. Together they conceived Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable, code names as quiet and unassuming as the missions themselves. The goal was simple in theory, audacious in execution. On the night of June 5th, create the appearance of two massive invasion fleets approaching the French coast, one near Boulogne, another near Le Havre, to convince the Germans that the main landings were coming not at Normandy, but at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point across the Channel. To make this mirage believable, the Allies needed more than radio chatter or dummy ships. They needed moving radar targets, echoes that behaved like convoys advancing at sea speed. That's when the idea of using balloons as radar reflectors took form. Each carried bundles of chaff that, when dispersed, painted bright, steady blips on radar screens. Released in waves from aircraft flying precise paths, they could simulate entire armadas creeping across the Channel. British No. 617 Squadron, the famous Dam Busters, trained for the mission, joined by U.S. Army Air Force's units providing technical coordination. Navigators practiced dropping chaff clouds on perfect intervals, while engineers calculated how wind and humidity would alter radar reflection. Every variable mattered. The deception had to look real not for minutes, but for hours. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles inland, another deception brewed. Operation Titanic. This was the airborne counterpart, a phantom parachute assault. Dummy paratroopers made of burlap and straw, nicknamed Rupert, would be dropped alongside noise-generating devices and flares, accompanied by a few real Special Air Service men to lend authenticity. It was theater performed across a continent, staged by scientists and soldiers alike. The Americans contributed the precision. The British, the flair for misdirection. Together, they built what historian Thaddeus Holt later called the most elaborate hoax of war. It required not bullets, but mathematics. Not courage in the trenches, but courage of imagination. On June 3rd, the final weather brief confirmed the narrow invasion window. As the fleets prepared to sail, so too did the ghosts. The balloons were loaded aboard modified bombers and small craft, each bundle of foil carefully measured to match the radar frequencies of Würzburg sets. Engineers logged the data in notebooks that would never be declassified until decades later. When the orders came, they were simple. Commence radar deception. Maintain illusions until dawn. In that moment, science crossed the threshold into battle. The work of quiet men in laboratories would soon meet the winds of the Channel, and the eyes of an enemy staring into green screens, believing they were witnessing the invasion of Europe. As night fell on June 5th, the engineers gathered near the airfields at Manston and Lympne. They watched as aircraft lifted off one by one, each carrying its shimmering cargo. The sky over England pulsed with light, real and false, and the first waves of deception drifted into history. The radar war had begun in earnest, and before dawn, it would save thousands of lives. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They carried no rifles, wore no medals, and marched under no banners. Yet their work would shield tens of thousands of men crossing the Channel. In the months before D-Day, the Allied deception engineers lived in the twilight between science and secrecy. At bases like Malvern, Bawdsey, and Langley, teams of young Americans and British physicists shared crowded workshops filled with radio coils, foil sheets, and grease pencils. They called themselves boffins, half in jest, half in pride. But the war depended on their equations. Among them were American Signal Corps officers who had left university laboratories for a new kind of front line. One recalled, "We didn't build weapons, we built ghosts." Their battlefield was invisible, an electromagnetic war where reflection, pulse, and interference could mean life or death. Every late-night calculation, every radar trace was a kind of prayer that the deception would hold, that the men storming the beaches would never know how close they came to detection. Tactically, the brilliance of the radar deception lay in timing. The German Freya radar network rotated in a synchronized pattern along the coast, covering each sector in sequence. The Allies studied these rhythms obsessively, learning when and where the screens would overlap. Using that knowledge, the chaff-carrying balloons and aircraft were released in waves, timed to appear precisely when the German operators were watching. To those operators, the radar echoes seemed flawless, a dense mass of reflections moving steadily toward Calais and Boulogne, exactly as an invasion fleet might. The illusion deepened as Allied transmitters sent false radio traffic, mimicking fleet commanders and convoy escorts. Even the German listening posts at Cherbourg intercepted the chatter. It confirmed what they already believed. The invasion was beginning, just not in Normandy. But deception is not victory unless the enemy believes it. The true genius of the engineers was psychological. They understood that Germany's obsession with Calais was not just geographic, it was emotional. For months, Allied intelligence had fed that belief through Operation Fortitude, planting false agents and reports pointing to Calais as the invasion point. The radar deception, when it came, was the perfect confirmation of a lie already seeded. Inside German command bunkers, officers who trusted their machines over their instincts found themselves prisoners of their own logic. The radar images didn't lie, or so they thought. As one post-war report by the German 15th Army recorded, the night of June 5, 1944, we observed heavy ship movements toward Boulogne. Our assumption was immediate: invasion at Calais. For nearly 10 critical hours, the German reserve divisions waited for an attack that never came. Meanwhile, over the dark waters of the Channel, the engineers' balloons drifted on, their foil ribbons scattering signals in perfect imitation of steel hulls. Each reflected pulse, Each shimmering echo was a heartbeat in an invisible shield. In the control rooms back in England, radar technicians watched their own screens fill with duplicate ghosts. They could only hope the enemy's vision was as confused as theirs. One British officer described it later. It was like fighting with mirrors. No noise, no flame, but every reflection meant a life saved. The human cost of such work was not measured in blood, but in doubt. They could not see the faces they protected. They only trusted the mathematics. That trust between scientist and soldier was the quiet backbone of the Allied invasion. As the night deepened and the last chaff clouds began to settle over the sea, the illusion continued to move, slow and steady, like a fleet advancing toward its fate. And somewhere beneath those silent echoes, the real ships gathered in darkness, their faith resting on the work of invisible men. In the airfields and laboratories of Britain, the deception took shape piece by piece, a blend of physics, intuition, and improvisation. Each balloon, each strip of foil represented hundreds of calculations. The engineers understood radar like composers understood sound. To deceive, one had to conduct an orchestra of echoes. The technology was delicate in its simplicity. Each chaff strip, cut to roughly 27 centimeters for the German 560 MHz radar band, acted as a tiny mirror, reflecting signals back to the emitter. One strip was nothing. A million created a storm. The engineers bundled them into packages weighing a few kilograms each to be dropped or dispersed at specific intervals. The balloons themselves, crafted from rubberized fabric, carried either radar reflective panels or timed dispensers that released chaff clouds as they drifted. Released in precise formations, they produced the radar profile of moving fleets, ghost convoys that advanced without engines or steel. It was an act of invisible artistry, a symphony of physics and deception. The U.S. engineers added precision to the spectacle. Working with the British Telecommunications Research Establishment, they devised mathematical models predicting how radar waves would scatter through metallic debris. Every pulse, every echo, had to simulate the radar cross-section of an actual ship. Even the speed of the illusion was calculated. Approximately 8 knots, matching a landing fleet's approach. To the German operators at Boulogne and Le Havre, the Phantom invasion appeared real in every measurable way. But the operation required more than machines. It demanded leadership willing to gamble on illusion. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his chief deception planners, including Colonel John Bevan and General Frederick Morgan, understood that success depended not only on overwhelming force, but on faith in the unseen. If the deception failed, if the Germans saw through the illusion, tens of thousands of soldiers in the real invasion force could be slaughtered on the beaches of Normandy before they even landed. The responsibility weighed heavily. Eisenhower's approval of the radar deception plans was quiet, decisive, and final. If it saves 1 hour of surprise, he told his staff, it's worth the effort. Under Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, the Air Operations Command coordinated the flights that would carry and release the chaff. Crews trained for weeks, rehearsing at night to perfect the rhythm of the drops. Everything depended on consistency. The same flight speed, the same altitude, the same timing. Even a deviation of seconds could shatter the illusion on enemy radar screens. The pilots would never see the battle they shaped. Their mission was to vanish into the dark, leaving only confusion in their wake. And then came the moral question. One whispered but never written. Could deception in war be a form of mercy? These engineers and commanders were not creating destruction. They were creating delay, uncertainty, hesitation. In that hesitation lay life. Every minute that German divisions waited at Calais instead of moving toward Normandy saved Allied soldiers storming Omaha, Utah, and Gold Beaches. It was war without bloodshed, but no less perilous, for its failure would bring catastrophe. Historians later described these acts as the camouflage of conscience, a deception designed not to kill, but to protect, not to destroy truth, but to save it from annihilation. In the silence of those early hours on June 6th, the engineers' creations floated unseen over the channel. The faint hiss of escaping hydrogen, the whisper of foil strips tumbling into night air. These were the sounds of salvation. To them, each balloon was not a machine, but a prayer, that science could serve humanity even in its darkest hour. They had turned physics into protection, mathematics into mercy, and when dawn came over the channel, the illusion still held, a constellation of echoes shimmering across German radar screens, pointing away from Normandy, away from the truth. The stage was set. The ghosts had done their part, and beneath their cover, the largest amphibious invasion in history was about to begin. June 5, 1944, 23:45 hours. Over the south of England, the rain has cleared. The moon hangs low and pale, its reflection flickering on the restless water below. In the darkness, engines hum, slow, steady, deliberate. From the airfields at Manston, Gravesend, and Bournemouth, the first squadrons of aircraft rise into the night. They carry no bombs, no men, no death. Only the soft weight of deception, chaff bundles, reflective balloons, and faith. The pilots of Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable fly in silence, guided by instruments and the glow of phosphorescent dials. Their orders: maintain perfect course, drop chaff every 12 seconds, and hold formation for 2 hours. Each pilot knows that down below, the real invasion fleet is already moving. Thousands of ships cutting across the channel toward Normandy. Their mission is to make sure the enemy looks elsewhere. At Boulogne, German radar stations hum to life. The Würzburg sets begin their scans. Within minutes, their green screens light up. Dozens of bright returns appear from the northwest. Then hundreds. To the operators, it looks unmistakable. Fleets of landing craft advancing across the channel in precise formation. The echoes are clean, rhythmic, and numerous, far too many for any mere diversion. The illusion is perfect. In Berlin's Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, reports stream in through encrypted channels. Coastal commands at Boulogne and Calais report massive ship movements. At Le Havre, the same. Panic ripples through the command chain. If this is the invasion, it is coming for Calais, the very place Hitler himself has insisted was the true Allied objective. The deception has found its target, the German mind. Meanwhile, the skies above the real invasion route, Normandy, remain eerily quiet. The German 15th Army, stationed near Calais, waits for orders to move. The 7th Army, guarding Normandy, receives no reinforcement orders until it is too late. As the chaff clouds drift eastward, the German radar operators attempt to verify their readings. They increase the gain on their scopes, but the returns multiply instead of fading. They change frequency bands. The echoes remain. The air seems alive with movement. It is as if the channel itself has risen in steel. On board a German radar station near Ouessant, an officer scribbles frantic notes. Large-scale ship presence approaching Boulogne sector. Estimated arrival, 02 hours. The report is sent up the chain. The coastal batteries adjust their guns. Searchlights pivot. Engines roar to life. For the next 4 hours, they wait for a fleet that never comes. Above them, the last of the chaff waves are released. Each burst sparkles faintly as it falls, invisible from below, but bright as a constellation on radar screens. The aircraft turn back toward England, fuel nearly gone, mission complete. Behind them, thousands of phantom echoes drift across the night. At 02:30 hours, the first paratroopers of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions begin their descent over Normandy. The Germans are looking the wrong way. By dawn, over Pas de Calais, radar screens still pulse with false fleets. The illusion has held through the most critical hours of the invasion. German General Hans von Salmuth, commanding the 15th Army, refuses to release his armored reserves to Normandy, convinced that the Calais assault is the main attack. Only when the sun rises over Omaha and Utah beaches, when the scale of the real landings becomes undeniable, does the truth begin to sink in. But by then, it is too late. The engineers' ghosts have bought the most precious currency in war: time. Hours that would decide the fate of nations. The balloons, the foil, the mathematics, all invisible, all decisive. As one RAF officer later wrote, "We did not destroy the enemy's eyes. We made them dream, and while they dreamed, the armies of liberation came ashore." June 6, 1944, 03:30 hours. The channel lies under a soft gray mist, calm yet trembling. The great Allied armada moves silently beneath it, thousands of ships carrying men toward Normandy's coast. Above, their protectors are not fighters or bombers, but illusions drifting in the night wind. The radar ghosts of Operation Glimmer and Taxable now stretch across 60 miles of sea, shimmering like false constellations. German radar posts from Boulogne to Le Havre record identical readings. Dense, coordinated fleets closing in. Reports flood the 15th Army headquarters. General Hans von Salmuth reads them with grim satisfaction. The long-awaited invasion has begun, just where Hitler predicted. At Haut-Fordeur, he orders his reserve panzer divisions to remain in place near Calais. "Hold position. The main blow is at the north," his signal reads. It is a fatal decision. By that same hour, 200 kilometers to the southwest, the first Allied landing craft approach Utah Beach. The real invasion has begun, shielded by illusions. The German radar network, flooded with phantom echoes, cannot distinguish truth from deception. Even the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader 26, stationed near Lille, is ordered to patrol the skies above Boulogne, nowhere near Normandy. The deception has achieved what no weapon could. Paralysis. At 05:15, German Würzburg radar crews at Cap Gris-Nez attempt to correct for the strange readings. They lower their antenna angles, seeking confirmation of real ships, but the echoes remain strong even as the sea horizon shifts. One operator records in his logbook, "unending returns," possibly strong interference or jamming. But it isn't jamming. It's wind, carrying aluminum clouds across the channel, each one a mirror of confusion. On the ground, the German Kampfstaffeln, coastal artillery batteries, open fire toward the false fleet. Their shells splash harmlessly into empty sea. Observers along the coast report nothing but foam and smoke. Still, headquarters insists the fleet is there. The radar does not lie. For 6 critical hours, the illusion holds. As dawn rises, the full panorama of deception glows faintly under the early sun. The foil strips still drift on ocean currents, reflecting light like frost upon the waves. The balloons, some collapsing, bob gently on the tide, their cords trailing like veins across the water. They are lifeless objects, yet their silent performance reshapes history. By mid-morning, Hitler himself is briefed. Still half asleep at his mountain retreat, he refuses to release the Panzergruppe West. "The main attack is not yet at hand," he declares. "Normandy is a feint." His words seal the delay. The hours that follow are carnage, but they are also deliverance. On the beaches of Omaha, Gold, Sword, and Utah, Allied soldiers fight through fire and chaos, yet reinforcements pour in unchallenged from the sea. The armored divisions that could have crushed them remain immobilized far to the north, guarding a phantom invasion. For every balloon that floated, For every radar echo that glimmered across the German screens, a real man reached the shore alive. By nightfall, the Allies hold 5 beaches. In the after-action summaries, one line from the deception planners stands out. Operations Glimmer and Taxable succeeded in misleading enemy radar and delaying the 15th Army response. Estimated casualties prevented, several thousand. It was a victory written not in blood, but in wavelengths, in reflections and silence. The engineers who designed it would never stand in parades or see their names carved into memorials. Yet their ghosts, the ones they created and the ones they saved, lingered in every wave that broke upon those beaches. The illusion had ended, but its echo would carry through every radar screen that followed. A reminder that in war, vision is not always truth. And sometimes, the greatest weapon is the one that makes the enemy see what isn't there. When the guns fell silent over the Channel on the evening of June 6, 1944, the battle for Normandy had entered its second day, and the first reports from intelligence units began to arrive. Among them were cables from the Allied Expeditionary Air Force and the Signal Corps, summarizing the performance of radar countermeasures. The language was dry, technical, almost indifferent. Yet between the lines lay one of the most extraordinary triumphs of the war. Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable successful, the first dispatch read. German radar misinterpreted echoes as large-scale invasion fleets. 15th Army reserves delayed by 8 to 12 hours. 8 hours. That small measure of time, invisible, immeasurable on a battlefield, had saved the lives of thousands. In war rooms across southern England, officers gathered around the decoded German intercepts. They watched the reports unfold hour by hour, reading the confusion of their adversaries. Radar logs from the French coast, captured after the invasion, confirmed what the Allies had hoped. German operators at Boulogne, Le Havre, and Calais had recorded dense radar traffic through the night of June 5th to 6th, movements consistent with large fleets. But their screens had been filled not with ships, but with drifting clusters of chaff and balloons. One American Signal Corps colonel, reviewing the evidence, wrote in his field notes, "The deception has functioned as designed. Radar returns of a magnitude equal to fleet activity. No further reports of enemy adjustment until 0900 hours. By that time, the beaches of Normandy were secure." The engineers who had built the illusions gathered again at their makeshift headquarters at Malvern. They spoke little. Many had been awake for nearly 48 hours, monitoring the radar screens and decoding enemy transmissions. The relief came not with cheers, but with silence, the kind born of disbelief. They had turned invisible light into armor. At the Telecommunications Research Establishment, technicians began plotting graphs comparing German radar intercepts with Allied release times. The match was near perfect. The reflected signals had reached their intended sectors at precisely the right intervals, forming what intelligence analysts later described as a wall of false invasion data. The technology had done more than confuse. It had persuaded. And persuasion, in war, is victory. British Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory sent a private memorandum to Eisenhower's staff noting the success of the radar deception. He praised the courage of the technical units whose weapons were silence and wind. Eisenhower, in his personal notes that evening, wrote a single sentence. "The trick worked. Thank God." But the engineers themselves would not be decorated. Their contribution, cloaked in secrecy, was classified for decades. The public never saw their faces, and their experiments remained hidden under the label Countermeasures Division, Confidential. Yet the commanders knew. Without those engineers, those quiet inventors of illusion, the beaches of Normandy might have run red with the blood of a failed invasion. Across the Channel, captured German reports told the other half of the story. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, absent from Normandy on the morning of June 6th, received word too late. His own radar intelligence had insisted that the invasion would strike at Calais. The deception had reached even him. In his post-war interrogation, he admitted, "We were misled by radar reports. We believed the landings at Normandy were diversionary. For the Allies, this confirmation was vindication. Proof that deception could shape strategy as powerfully as steel and gunpowder." By mid-June, the last fragments of the chaff clouds had fallen into the sea, their silver fragments glinting under the sun like the remnants of a broken mirror. Fishermen would later collect them, mistaking them for strange seaweed. They did not know that these remnants had already written part of history. In laboratories and intelligence offices, the engineers quietly began documenting their data for future study. The notebooks filled with numbers, frequencies, and release patterns became the first textbooks of modern electronic warfare. The war had changed forever. The age of reflection had begun. And while armies advanced across France, a handful of scientists sat by the coast, watching the waves, knowing that their ghosts had done their work, and wondering if anyone would ever know how. When the invasion of Normandy succeeded, the attention of the world turned to the beaches, to the bravery of the infantry and the thunder of artillery. But in the quiet corridors of British and American laboratories, another kind of victory was being studied. One fought not in mud or fire, but in silence and reflection. Within weeks of D-Day, Allied intelligence compiled an extensive technical analysis titled Radar Countermeasures, Operations Glimmer, Taxable, and Titanic. It recorded the success of the deception with almost clinical precision, the range of radar distortion, the duration of false signals, and the German delay times in mobilizing reserves. Buried in those tables and graphs was an extraordinary truth: that a handful of scientists with aluminum foil and balloons had manipulated the perceptions of an entire army. The chaff technology, once an improvised experiment, was now a classified weapon. Its potential reached far beyond Normandy. Soon, window and rope would accompany every major Allied air raid, cloaking bombers under storms of metallic snow. The same principles that confused radar in 1944 would, decades later, guide stealth bombers and electronic countermeasures that could blind missiles mid-flight. U.S. Army engineers refined the technique further, developing automatic chaff dispensers for aircraft and naval ships. The British adapted balloon reflectors for coastal defense, using them to simulate radar targets and draw enemy fire away from real convoys. The illusion had become a permanent tool, the art of deception, now a discipline of science. As Allied forces pushed deeper into France, radar deception followed them. Mobile rope units traveled with advancing armies, laying traps of false echoes to misdirect Luftwaffe night fighters. What had begun as a single night's experiment over the Channel evolved into a doctrine of electronic warfare, a recognition that in modern combat, control of perception could decide control of reality. In post-war years, the same engineers who had built the ghosts of D-Day became pioneers in radar and communications research. The U.S. Signal Corps and Britain's Royal Radar establishment transformed their wartime secrecy into the technological foundations of the Cold War. From their experiments came the first electronic jammers, radar warning receivers, and early stealth coatings. The ghosts of Normandy became the ancestors of every invisible weapon that would follow. But the moral resonance of their work endured. The deception at Normandy had not been an act of cruelty. It was an act of preservation. The engineers had chosen to confuse rather than destroy, to mislead rather than annihilate. In a war defined by horror, theirs was a quiet defiance of brutality. Years later, one British scientist, reflecting on those nights, said softly, "Our weapons were wind and foil, but they saved flesh and blood." His words became the epitaph of an entire invisible generation. Men and women who had fought with mathematics, not munitions. The war ended, but the chaff never disappeared. Even into the jet age, pilots carried it as a final defense. Thin strips of aluminum that bloomed into clouds of false targets when released. A small echo of 1944 still lived in every burst. Somewhere in the archives of the Royal Air Force lies a simple notation from that summer. Radar deception successful. Enemy fooled. Casualties minimal. No medals. No speeches. No monuments. Just that line typed in black ink. And yet, in that understatement lies the measure of their achievement. The balloons had risen in darkness, carrying only the whisper of possibility. They had fooled machines built to see everything, and in doing so, they had proved that in a world consumed by destruction, even illusion could serve the cause of life. The sea eventually swallowed the last fragments of foil, but their reflections remain. In every radar screen, in every pulse of electromagnetic light, reminders that war is fought not only with power, but with perception. The ghosts of glimmer and taxable still drift, unseen, across history's horizon. The war ended with parades and silence. The guns that had once shattered continents now rusted beneath the same skies that had carried the illusions of D-Day. And yet, when the wind swept across the channel at dusk, one could almost imagine those shapes still drifting, the silver ghosts that saved the living. The story of the balloons is more than a footnote in a vast war. It is a story of how intellect and compassion can coexist within conflict. At a time when the world was consumed by destruction, engineers chose to fight with reflection, not flame. Their battleground was invisible, their weapon, understanding. In the cold glow of radar screens, they learned something timeless, that the greatest strength of democracy lies not in its power to destroy, but in its imagination to preserve. Each glimmer of foil that night represented more than metal. It was the shimmer of an idea, the idea that freedom defends itself not only with force, but with ingenuity. That deception, when guided by conscience, can serve truth. Long after the war, when technology turned skyward into satellites and stealth aircraft, the principles of window and rope still lived on. Modern radars, missile seekers, and stealth coatings all trace their lineage to those quiet June nights when chaff floated like snow over the channel, and the fate of thousands hung upon the mathematics of illusion. The same frequencies that once guided bombs became the frequencies that guided communication, navigation, even peace. The engineers who worked in secret rarely spoke of their achievement, but their legacy hums in every radar pulse that scans the skies today. A reminder that the line between war and mercy can be drawn in wavelengths thinner than air. In the end, it was not the roar of engines or the thunder of guns that saved the soldiers of Normandy. It was the whisper of aluminum in the wind, 1,000 tiny mirrors, catching the light of freedom as they fell. And in their silent descent, they told a truth only war could teach, that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are the ones that remain unseen,